The evacuation helicopter lifted off without her. Major Rebecca Hayes watched from the rooftop as the last transport disappeared into the smoke-filled sky, carrying the final group of civilians to safety. Behind her, gunfire echoed through the abandoned streets of Karadish, a city that had become a nightmare in less than 48 hours. She was supposed to be on that helicopter. Instead, she stood alone on a rooftop in enemy territory, with 23 American contractors trapped somewhere in the chaos below. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her radio crackled with static before Colonel Marcus Garrett's voice cut through. Hayes, what's your status? The extraction window is closed. Rebecca adjusted her gear and checked her weapon. Negative on extraction, sir. I have 23 souls unaccounted for. Hayes, that's a direct order. You cannot. She switched off the radio and tossed it aside. Some orders weren't meant to be followed. 3 months earlier, Rebecca Hayes had been the subject of heated debate in the Pentagon's oak-paneled conference rooms. At 28, she possessed an impressive service record, but Colonel Marcus Garrett remained unconvinced about her latest assignment. She's too green for this operation, Garrett declared, sliding a thick file across the polished table toward General Patricia Williams. Hayes lacks the experience for a deployment of this magnitude. General Williams opened the file, scanning Rebecca's credentials with practiced efficiency. Combat tours in Afghanistan, specialized training in hostage recovery, fluent in 4 languages, including Arabic and Farsi, expert marksman ratings across multiple weapon systems. The woman's record spoke volumes, yet Garrett's concerns carried weight in these halls. Her psychological evaluation shows excellent stress management and decision-making under pressure, Williams noted, flipping through pages of assessments and recommendations. The CIA specifically requested her for this assignment. Garrett leaned back in his leather chair, his jaw set in disapproval. Psychological evaluations don't stop bullets, General. We're talking about Karadish, one of the most volatile regions in the Middle East. The contractor security detail needs someone with field command experience, not a by-the-book soldier who's never run an independent operation. The debate had raged for 2 hours before Williams made her decision. Rebecca Hayes would lead the security detail for American contractors working on a critical infrastructure project in Karadish. The assignment would either prove Garrett right or establish Hayes as one of the military's rising stars. Rebecca learned about her deployment while reviewing training schedules in her quarters at Fort Bragg. The knock on her door came at 0600 hours sharp, followed by a junior officer delivering sealed orders that would change everything. The mission briefing took place in a windowless room, where maps of Karadish covered every available wall surface. CIA operative James Morrison, a thin man with prematurely gray hair and eyes like chips of ice, outlined the situation with clinical precision. Phoenix Industries has been contracted to rebuild the power grid in Karadish, Morrison explained, pointing to various locations marked in red on the largest map. It's a $100 million project that could stabilize the entire region if completed successfully. Your job is to keep their people alive while they work. Rebecca studied the terrain, noting choke points, escape routes, and potential ambush sites. Karadish sat in a valley surrounded by mountains, creating natural defensive positions for anyone wanting to cause trouble. The main road in and out of the city could be easily blocked, turning the entire area into a trap. What's the current threat assessment? She asked, tracing a finger along the mountain ridges. Morrison's expression darkened. Fluid. 3 different rebel factions operate in the area, each with their own agenda. The government forces are supposed to provide security, but they're stretched thin and unreliable. Intelligence suggests something big is brewing, but we don't know what or when. The contractor team consisted of 23 engineers, technicians, and project managers, all civilians with minimal security training. Rebecca would work with a small support staff of 4 military personnel, responsible for protecting nearly 30 people in hostile territory. During the flight to Kuradish, Rebecca sat beside Dr. Sarah Chun, Phoenix Industries lead engineer. Chun, a brilliant woman in her early 30s, had volunteered for the assignment despite warnings about the security situation. "I've seen what happens when infrastructure fails," Chun explained as their transport aircraft crossed into regional airspace. "People die from preventable diseases, businesses collapse, children can't go to school. This power grid could save thousands of lives." Rebecca admired Chun's dedication while privately calculating the challenges ahead. Protecting motivated civilians often proved more difficult than securing military personnel, since civilians didn't always understand why certain restrictions existed. Their arrival in Kuradish revealed a city struggling between hope and despair. New construction competed with bombed-out buildings for space along ancient streets. Children played soccer in lots where shops had once stood, while vendors sold fresh bread from carts positioned next to blast barriers. The Phoenix Industries compound occupied a former government building that had been hastily converted for their use. Rebecca immediately began cataloging security deficiencies: insufficient lighting around the perimeter, only 2 exit routes, no proper communication center, and quarters that put civilians too close to potential breach points. "This place is a nightmare," muttered Sergeant Dave Thompson, Rebecca's second-in-command. A veteran of 3 combat tours, Thompson had seen enough dangerous assignments to recognize trouble when it appeared. "We make it work," Rebecca replied, already sketching modifications in her notebook. "We'll need better sight lines from the roof, communication redundancy, and a proper safe room for the civilians." Within 72 hours, Rebecca had transformed the compound's security posture. She established patrol schedules, created emergency protocols, and built relationships with local security forces. The Phoenix team settled into their routines, with Chun's group making rapid progress on the power grid assessment. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning when Rebecca received intelligence that made her blood run cold. Morrison contacted her through encrypted channels with news that 3 rebel factions had formed an unlikely alliance, united by their opposition to the American-backed infrastructure project. "They see the power grid as a symbol of foreign interference," Morrison explained during their secure video call. "Our sources indicate they're planning something significant, but details remain unclear." Rebecca doubled security measures immediately. Patrols increased, civilians received strict instructions about movement limitations, and she established direct communication links with government forces in the area. Despite these precautions, she couldn't shake the feeling that events were spiraling beyond her control. The first attack came at dawn on Thursday, a coordinated assault that tested every defensive measure Rebecca had implemented. Mortar rounds impacted the compound's outer walls while small arms fire erupted from multiple directions. The precision and timing indicated careful planning and inside knowledge of their security procedures. Rebecca coordinated the defense from the compound's communication center, directing her small team with calm efficiency while keeping civilians safe in the reinforced areas she designated. The attack lasted 40 minutes before government forces arrived to drive off the insurgents. In the aftermath, as Rebecca surveyed damage and checked on her people, she discovered something troubling. The attackers had known exactly where to find weak spots in their defenses, targeting areas that weren't visible from outside observation. Someone had provided them with detailed intelligence about the compound's layout and security measures. "We have a leak," she told Morrison during their post-incident debrief. Someone gave them information they couldn't have obtained through external surveillance. Morrison's face remained expressionless on the video screen. "Are you certain?" "Positive. They knew which windows weren't bulletproof, where we kept emergency supplies, and the exact timing of our patrol rotations." This was an inside job. The realization that someone within their circle had betrayed them created an atmosphere of tension and suspicion that threatened to undermine everything Rebecca had built. She couldn't trust local security forces, couldn't rely on government support, and now faced the possibility that one of her own people had sold them out to insurgents. Chun approached her the following morning with news that the power grid project was ahead of schedule. "We can complete the primary installations within 2 weeks," she reported. "That's a month earlier than originally planned." Rebecca saw an opportunity in Chun's efficiency. If they could finish the project quickly and evacuate before the insurgents organized another major attack, everyone might survive the assignment. She began developing contingency plans for rapid completion and emergency extraction. Karadish had other plans for Major Rebecca Hayes. Intelligence reports indicated that the insurgent alliance was growing stronger, recruiting fighters from across the region. Government forces were being withdrawn to defend the capital against a separate threat, leaving the Phoenix compound increasingly isolated. On Saturday morning, Rebecca woke to the sound of distant explosions. She rushed to the roof and saw smoke rising from the government military base 5 miles away. Through binoculars, she watched as insurgent forces overran the facility, eliminating the last significant military presence in the immediate area. Her radio crackled with urgent transmissions from various sources, painting a picture of complete chaos. Insurgent forces had launched a coordinated offensive across the entire region, targeting government installations, foreign workers, and infrastructure projects. Karadish was under siege, and the Phoenix compound stood alone in the middle of a war zone. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rebecca gathered her team for an emergency briefing in the compound's main conference room. Maps covered the table while intelligence reports continued arriving through their remaining communication channels. "The situation has deteriorated beyond our original parameters," she announced to faces that reflected growing concern. "Government forces have withdrawn or been overrun. We're effectively surrounded by hostile forces with unknown intentions." "Doctor." Chun raised her hand. "How long before evacuation?" "Unknown. Command is working on extraction options, but air support may be unavailable due to surface-to-air missile threats. We need to prepare for an extended siege." Over the next 3 days, Rebecca's small team worked around the clock to strengthen their defenses while insurgent forces tightened their grip on Karadish. Food and ammunition were carefully rationed. Communication with the outside world became increasingly sporadic as insurgents destroyed cell towers and communication infrastructure. On Tuesday evening, Rebecca received what would be her final transmission from Colonel Garrett. His voice carried barely concealed frustration as he delivered news that would test everything she'd learned about leadership and sacrifice. "Hayes, we have a narrow window for helicopter extraction at 0800 hours tomorrow. The LZ will be the school rooftop 2 blocks north of your position. You have 15 minutes maximum before we abort due to enemy fire." Rebecca calculated quickly. 27 people needed evacuation, but the helicopters could only carry 18 passengers per trip. With enemy forces controlling the area around the landing zone, there wouldn't be time for multiple trips. "Sir, we have 27 souls requiring extraction. Can we get additional aircraft?" Garrett's response came after a long pause. "Negative. 1 helicopter, 1 trip. You'll need to prioritize personnel for evacuation." The weight of that decision settled on Rebecca's shoulders like a physical burden. She would have to choose who lived and who remained behind in a war zone. The Phoenix Industries civilians were her primary responsibility, but leaving her own military personnel felt like the ultimate betrayal. That night, Rebecca didn't sleep. She sat on the compound's roof, watching muzzle flashes light up the darkness while working through impossible calculations. No matter how she approached the problem, someone would be left behind when the evacuation helicopter departed. At 0630 hours, she gathered everyone in the main hall for final instructions. 27 faces looked at her with expressions ranging from hope to barely controlled terror. These people had trusted her to keep them safe, and now she faced the ultimate test of that trust. "Evacuation begins in 90 minutes, she announced. Dr. Chun will lead the civilian team to the landing zone. Sergeant Thompson will provide security during movement to the LZ. She paused, meeting each person's eyes before continuing. The helicopter can accommodate 18 passengers. All Phoenix Industries personnel will be evacuated first, along with essential equipment and data. The silence that followed her announcement spoke volumes. Everyone understood the mathematics involved, even if they didn't want to acknowledge the implications. 9 people would remain behind in Karadish when the helicopter departed. Rebecca spent the final hour before evacuation, conducting last-minute security checks and ensuring that everyone understood their role in the extraction operation. She distributed the remaining ammunition among her military personnel and established fallback positions in case the evacuation went wrong. At 0745 hours, the evacuation convoy departed the compound for the 2-block journey to the school rooftop. Rebecca led the formation while Thompson brought up the rear, with civilians protected in the middle. Every shadow could hide a sniper. Every doorway might conceal an ambush. The helicopter appeared exactly on schedule, a black dot against the gray morning sky that grew larger as it approached the landing zone. Rebecca felt a mix of relief and dread as the aircraft settled onto the rooftop with rotors spinning, ready for immediate departure. Loading proceeded efficiently despite the chaos surrounding them. Dr. Chun and her team boarded quickly, followed by essential equipment and research data. Rebecca maintained security while counting heads and calculating remaining capacity. 18 seats filled rapidly, leaving 9 members of their group standing on the rooftop as insurgent gunfire erupted from nearby buildings. The helicopter pilot's voice crackled through her headset with urgent warnings about enemy movement and the need for immediate departure. Rebecca made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She stepped back from the helicopter and motioned for Thompson to board with the remaining military personnel. Her 4 soldiers looked at her with expressions of disbelief and protest. "That's an order, Sergeant," she shouted over the rotor noise. "Get these people to safety." Thompson hesitated for a moment before saluting and climbing aboard. The helicopter lifted off with its maximum passenger load, carrying 23 members of the Phoenix Industries team and 4 military personnel to safety. Rebecca watched it disappear into the distance before turning to face the 9 contractors who hadn't made it aboard. "Ma'am," called out Mark Stevens, a senior engineer who'd been with Phoenix for 15 years. "What do we do now?" Rebecca checked her weapon and surveyed their surroundings. Insurgent forces were closing in from multiple directions, drawn by the helicopter's noise and obvious target. The school building offered some defensive advantages, but they couldn't hold it indefinitely against superior numbers. "We survive," she replied, already calculating their options. "And we find another way out." What happened next would become legend in military circles, a story of courage and determination that redefined what one person could accomplish when everything seemed impossible. But that was still hours away, as Rebecca Hayes prepared to lead 9 civilians through a war zone with nothing but her training, her determination, and an unshakable belief that leaving people behind was never an acceptable option. The school building shook as another mortar round exploded in the courtyard below. Rebecca pressed herself against the concrete wall, feeling dust and debris rain down from the ceiling. 9 civilians huddled in the corner of what had once been a chemistry classroom, their faces pale with terror as gunfire echoed through the corridors. "Major Hayes," whispered Lisa Parker, a communications specialist who'd been installing satellite equipment when the crisis began. They're in the building. Rebecca moved to the doorway, listening to boots on broken glass somewhere in the darkness. Below, the insurgents had breached the ground floor faster than expected. Her original plan to hold the upper levels until nightfall was already falling apart. She turned to face the group, studying each person carefully. These weren't soldiers trained for combat situations. Mark Stevens clutched a laptop containing critical project data. Jennifer Walsh, a project coordinator, kept checking her phone for signals that would never come. David Kim, barely 25 and fresh out of engineering school, looked like he might collapse from fear. "We're moving," Rebecca announced quietly. "There's a maintenance tunnel that connects this building to the old hospital complex 3 blocks east. We'll use it to avoid the street fighting." "What about the laptop?" Stevens asked, holding up the device like a lifeline. "This contains months of research data worth millions of dollars." "Leave it," Rebecca replied without hesitation. "Your life is worth more than any data." Stevens' face hardened with determination. This information could save thousands of lives. "When the power grid is rebuilt, I'm not abandoning it." Rebecca didn't have time to argue. She led the group down a service stairway, moving carefully to avoid the insurgents searching the main floors. The tunnel entrance lay hidden behind a rusted metal door in the building's basement, accessible only through a maze of storage rooms and mechanical spaces. The tunnel itself was a relic from the Soviet era, part of an underground network built during the Cold War. Water dripped from corroded pipes overhead, and the air smelled of decay and neglect. Rebecca used a small flashlight to navigate while keeping one hand on her weapon. "Stay close and stay quiet," she whispered as they entered the narrow passage. This tunnel runs for about 800 meters before reaching the hospital basement. The journey underground felt like hours but lasted only 20 minutes. They emerged into the abandoned hospital's lower level, where empty patient rooms stretched down long corridors lined with broken wheelchairs and medical equipment left behind. During earlier evacuations, Rebecca chose a room on the 3rd floor for their temporary base, positioning herself near windows that offered clear views of the surrounding streets. What she saw through those windows made her stomach clench with dread. Insurgent forces had established checkpoints at every major intersection. Armored vehicles patrolled the main roads, while teams of fighters searched building by building. The systematic nature of their operation suggested professional military training and outside support. "They're not just looking for us," she murmured, watching a squad kick down doors in a residential building across the street. "This is ethnic cleansing disguised as a military operation." Through her binoculars, Rebecca observed civilians being herded into trucks at gunpoint. Families separated. Men taken one direction while women and children disappeared into vehicles heading toward the mountains. The infrastructure project had been a pretext for something much darker. Jennifer Walsh joined her at the window, gasping when she saw the scene below. "Those are the families who helped us with the power grid installations. They trusted us, and now they're being punished for cooperating with Americans." The weight of unintended consequences settled heavily on Rebecca's shoulders. Every handshake with a local contractor, every payment for services rendered, every friendly conversation had marked innocent people for retribution. The Phoenix Industries project hadn't just failed. It had painted targets on anyone who'd shown them kindness. "We have to help them," Walsh continued, tears streaming down her face. "We can't just watch this happen." Rebecca lowered her binoculars and studied the tactical situation with professional detachment. 9 untrained civilians, limited ammunition, no communication with friendly forces, surrounded by hostile territory. Any rescue attempt would likely result in everyone's death. "Our priority is getting you people to safety," she replied. "We can't help anyone if we're dead." But even as she spoke those words, Rebecca's mind was working through possibilities. The insurgents were being methodical but not random in their target selection. They had lists, photographs, specific information about who had collaborated with. The Americans. Someone was directing this operation with detailed intelligence. That evening, while her charges tried to rest in the hospital's darkness, Rebecca conducted a solo reconnaissance of the surrounding area. She moved through shadows and rubble with practiced silence, gathering intelligence about enemy positions and patrol patterns. What she discovered changed everything. 3 blocks from the hospital, insurgent forces had established a detention center in the old municipal building. Through grimy windows, Rebecca counted at least 40 civilians being held under armed guard. She recognized several faces: Ahmed Hassan, who'd provided translation services; Maria Santos, a local engineer who'd worked closely with Dr. Chun; even children whose only crime had been accepting candy from American contractors. Among the prisoners, she spotted someone who made her heart race with recognition: Dr. Elena Vasquez, a Spanish medical volunteer who'd been treating injured workers. At the Phoenix compound, Vasquez had saved 3 lives during the first insurgent attack, working under fire to stabilize wounded personnel. Rebecca returned to the hospital with a decision that went against every tactical principle she'd been taught. Military doctrine emphasized mission completion and force preservation above individual heroics. But watching innocent people face execution for helping Americans violated something fundamental in her moral code. "I need to tell you something," she announced to her group the next morning. "The insurgents are holding about 40 civilians in a detention center downtown. People who helped us are going to be executed unless someone intervenes." Mark Stevens looked up from his precious laptop. "You're talking about a rescue mission with 9 civilians and 1 soldier against an entire insurgent army. That's suicide, not heroism." "I'm not asking you to come with me," Rebecca replied. "I'll establish you in a safe location with enough supplies to last until friendly forces arrive. But I can't abandon those people." David Kim, the young engineer who'd barely spoken since the evacuation, suddenly found his voice. "How many guards are at this detention center?" Rebecca was surprised by the question. "About 12, rotating in shifts of 4. "But Kim, you're not trained for this kind of operation." "Neither were the people who helped us build the power grid," Kim replied with unexpected steel in his voice. "My grandfather fought in Korea. He always said that technical skills mean nothing without moral courage." One by one, the other civilians began volunteering for what seemed like a hopeless mission. Lisa Parker had demolitions training from her Army Reserve Service. Jennifer Walsh spoke fluent Arabic and could pose as a local interpreter. Even Mark Stevens finally closed his laptop and offered his services. "This is insane," Rebecca protested. "You're civilians. I took an oath to protect you, not lead you into combat. And we took jobs helping people," Walsh responded. "Those prisoners are suffering because they helped us. We have a responsibility to make that right." Against her better judgment, Rebecca found herself planning the most audacious rescue operation of her career. 9 people with minimal combat training against a fortified position defended by experienced fighters. The odds were astronomical, but the alternative was abandoning innocent people to certain death. They spent 2 days preparing, scavenging equipment from the abandoned hospital, and conducting surveillance of the detention center. Rebecca taught basic combat techniques while her volunteers practiced moving silently through rubble-filled streets. Kim proved surprisingly adept at improvised explosives, using medical supplies to create diversionary devices. Parker's communications background helped them establish signal protocols using hand gestures and reflected light. Stevens discovered that his laptop could hack into the municipal building's old security system, potentially providing access codes for electronic locks. On the 3rd night, as they made final preparations for the rescue attempt, Rebecca received an unexpected visitor. A young local boy, maybe 12 years old, appeared at the hospital's back entrance, carrying a message from someone calling himself the teacher. "American soldier," the boy whispered in broken English. "Teacher says you Try to help prisoners. The teacher has information you need. The meeting took place in the ruins of an old mosque, where Rebecca found herself face to face with Dr. Hakim al-Rashid, a university professor who'd been documenting insurgent activities since the crisis began. Al-Rashid was a thin man with intelligent eyes and hands stained with ink from the journal he constantly wrote in. "The detention center is not what it appears," Al-Rashid explained in excellent English. "The building has underground chambers where they're holding the most important prisoners. Your Dr. Vasquez is down there, along with several local officials who oppose the insurgent takeover." He handed Rebecca a hand-drawn map showing the building's layout, including passages she hadn't discovered during her reconnaissance. "There are 28 people in the basement cells, all scheduled for execution tomorrow at dawn. The ceremony will be filmed for propaganda purposes." Rebecca studied the map, recalculating her plans based on this new intelligence. A basement rescue complicated everything, requiring longer exposure times and multiple exit routes. But it also presented opportunities if they could access the underground areas undetected. "Why are you helping us?" she asked Rashid. The professor's expression hardened. "Because these insurgents aren't fighting for our freedom. They're criminals and fanatics who use politics to justify murder. Your infrastructure project represented hope for our children's future. They destroyed that hope, and now they're killing anyone who dared to dream of something better." Al-Rashid provided more than intelligence. He offered active support. His network of university colleagues and students had been monitoring insurgent communications, tracking their movements, and documenting their crimes. With their help, Rebecca's impossible rescue mission suddenly seemed achievable. The operation began at midnight on a moonless Thursday. Rebecca led her team through deserted streets, using Al-Rashid's intelligence to avoid patrol routes and checkpoint locations. Each civilian carried specific equipment. Parker handled communications. Kim managed the explosive diversions. Walsh would serve as translator for the rescued prisoners. They reached the municipal building's rear entrance exactly on schedule. Stephen's laptop successfully interfaced with the old security system, unlocking service doors that hadn't been updated since the Soviet era. The insurgents had focused their security improvements on the main entrances, leaving vulnerabilities that a determined team could exploit. Rebecca entered first, moving through darkened corridors with her weapon ready. The building's interior showed signs of hasty conversion from government offices to military headquarters. Maps covered walls, ammunition boxes stacked in former conference rooms, and the smell of unwashed bodies indicated overcrowded conditions. The basement access required navigating past sleeping guards and through areas filled with communications equipment. Every step could trigger alarms or wake sentries, but Rebecca's team moved with surprising coordination for civilians with minimal training. In the basement, they found Hell. 20-8 people crammed into 4 concrete cells, many showing signs of torture and malnutrition. Dr. Vasquez looked up with disbelief when Rebecca appeared outside her cell, thinking she might be hallucinating from dehydration. "Elena, we're getting you out of here," Rebecca whispered as Stevens worked on the electronic locks. "Rebecca? But you evacuated. I saw the helicopter." "Long story. Can you walk?" Vasquez nodded weakly. "Most of us can move, but Ahmed has a broken leg, and Maria's daughter is only 8 years old." The rescue became exponentially more complex with injured prisoners and a terrified child. Rebecca's original timeline was already stretched, and now they needed to move much more slowly while supporting people who could barely stand. But as they prepared to evacuate the basement, alarms began blaring throughout the building. Someone had discovered their presence, and insurgent forces were mobilizing for a manhunt that would test every skill Rebecca had learned in her military career. The real battle was just beginning. The alarm's piercing wail echoed through the municipal building's corridors as Rebecca's mind shifted into combat mode. 28 prisoners needed evacuation, but insurgent forces were already pounding down the stairs toward their location. She had perhaps 90 seconds before armed fighters reached the basement. "Kim, set your charges at the main stairwell," she ordered quietly, her voice cutting through the rising panic among the rescued prisoners. "Parker, get on the radio and tell Al-Rashid we need his diversion now." David Kim's hands shook as he placed improvised explosive devices at strategic points, but his engineering precision remained intact. Each charge was positioned to create maximum debris while minimizing risk to the basement structure. Lisa Parker crouched beside a makeshift radio setup, transmitting coded messages to their allies scattered throughout the city. Dr. Elena Vasquez helped organize the prisoners into groups based on their physical condition. "Ahmed can't walk on that leg," she reported to Rebecca. "Maria's daughter Sophia is in shock. 3 others have infected wounds that make movement difficult." Rebecca counted heads while calculating escape routes. The building's blueprint showed 2 basement exits, the route they'd used to enter, now compromised by approaching insurgents, and a service tunnel that connected to the old sewer system. The tunnel hadn't been marked on any official maps, but Al-Rashid's intelligence network had discovered it during weeks of careful observation. "We're splitting into 3 groups," Rebecca announced, her voice carrying the authority that had earned her this impossible assignment. "Vasquez leads the injured through the service tunnel. Walsh takes the families with children through the rear emergency exit. I'll take the remaining prisoners through the main route and draw fire away from the others." Jennifer Walsh grabbed Rebecca's arm. "That's suicide. They'll concentrate all their firepower on your group." "That's the idea," Rebecca replied grimly. "Kim's charges will buy us time, but someone needs to keep their attention focused away from the civilians." Mark Stevens finally abandoned his precious laptop, using both hands to help support Ahmed Hassan's weight. "Major, what about extraction? We can't just wander around the city with 28 people." Before Rebecca could answer, Kim's explosives detonated with thunderous force that shook dust from the ceiling. Shouts and gunfire erupted from the upper floors as insurgent fighters found their primary access route blocked by tons of rubble. The diversions had begun. Al-Rashid's student network activated across Karadish simultaneously. Homemade bombs exploded near insurgent checkpoints. False radio transmissions reported American helicopter landings at multiple locations. University students emerged from hiding to spray paint anti-insurgent slogans on buildings before disappearing back into the urban maze. The coordinated chaos bought Rebecca precious minutes to begin the evacuation. Vasquez led 8 prisoners through a narrow maintenance tunnel that required crawling through spaces barely wide enough for human bodies. Walsh guided 6 families toward the rear exit, moving silently through corridors filled with smoke and confusion. Rebecca took the remaining 14 prisoners, including several local officials who'd been beaten severely during interrogation. These men and women had shown courage by opposing the insurgent takeover, and now they could barely walk. But their survival represented something larger than individual lives. They embodied hope for Karadish's future. The main basement corridor had become a war zone. Insurgent forces were rappelling through blown-out windows while others tried to clear Kim's rubble barriers. Gunfire ricocheted off concrete walls as Rebecca's group moved toward their exit point. "Stay low and keep moving," Rebecca instructed, returning fire while her charges stumbled through the smoke. Her weapon's familiar weight provided comfort in the chaos, each round carefully placed to maximum effect with minimal ammunition waste. They reached the ground floor to find the building's lobby transformed into a battlefield. Overturned furniture provided cover while broken glass crunched underfoot. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows that turned every corner into a potential ambush site. Rebecca spotted movement near the main entrance and raised her weapon, then lowered it when she recognized the distinctive blue jacket of Dr. Al-Rashid. The professor had somehow infiltrated the building during the confusion, carrying a medical bag and leading two of his students. "The rear courtyard is clear," al-Rashid reported breathlessly. "My people have created a corridor through the insurgent perimeter, but it won't last long." "How?" Rebecca asked while checking her ammunition count. "University students know this city better than foreign fighters," one of al-Rashid's companions replied with fierce pride. "We've been planning resistance operations since the crisis began." The escape route led through Karadesh's ancient market district, where narrow alleys and hidden passages created a maze that even local insurgents struggled to navigate effectively. Al-Rashid's students had spent weeks mapping every doorway, every rooftop, every potential hiding place. Rebecca's group moved through the city like ghosts, guided by young people who'd grown up playing in these streets. Sophia, Maria's 8-year-old daughter, had stopped crying and now helped translate between the American soldiers and local prisoners who spoke only Arabic. Behind them, the municipal building burned against the night sky while explosions continued echoing across Karadesh. Al-Rashid's diversion campaign was working better than anyone had dared hope, drawing insurgent forces away from the evacuation routes. Major Hayes called out one of the rescued officials, a man named Omar Khatib, who'd served as Karadesh's deputy mayor before the crisis. "Where are we going?" "The insurgents control all roads out of the city." Rebecca had been wondering the same thing. Their original plan had focused on reaching the detention center and freeing the prisoners, but she hadn't developed a comprehensive strategy for getting 28 people to safety. The helicopter evacuation point was compromised. Government forces had withdrawn, and insurgent checkpoints blocked every major route. "There's an old UN observation post in the mountains," al-Rashid suggested during a brief rest in an abandoned bakery. "It was deactivated years ago, but the communication equipment might still function. If we can reach it and broadcast our location." "That's 15 kilometers through hostile territory," Rebecca replied, studying a map by flashlight. "Half of these people can barely walk a few blocks." "My students have vehicles hidden throughout the city," one of al-Rashid's companions offered. "Not military trucks, but civilian cars and delivery vans that won't attract attention at checkpoints." The plan that emerged was audacious even by Rebecca's standards. They would split the rescued prisoners among multiple civilian vehicles, each taking different routes toward the mountains. Al-Rashid's students would drive, using their local knowledge to avoid patrols and roadblocks. Rebecca would accompany the most vulnerable group, including Dr. Vasquez and the families with children. Her military training and weapons provided their best protection if the convoy encountered trouble. At 0300 hours, 5 unmarked vehicles departed Karadesh through routes that avoided main roads and insurgent strongholds. Rebecca rode in a battered delivery truck with 8 prisoners, her weapon ready, but hoping civilian disguises would be sufficient. The journey revealed a city transformed by conflict. Buildings that had housed thriving businesses now stood empty and scarred by gunfire. Streets where children had played soccer were blocked by burned-out cars and improvised barriers. The infrastructure project that had brought such hope to Karadesh had become a symbol of everything the insurgents wanted to destroy. But Rebecca also saw signs of resistance that gave her hope. Graffiti in Arabic and English proclaimed messages of defiance. Windows displayed small flags and symbols supporting the legitimate government. Even under insurgent occupation, many citizens of Karadesh refused to surrender their dreams of a better future. The first checkpoint appeared without warning around a sharp curve in the mountain road. 2 insurgent fighters with automatic weapons stepped into the truck's headlights, gesturing for the driver to stop. Rebecca tensed, her hand moving toward her concealed weapon. The student driver, a young woman named Fatima, rolled down her window and began speaking rapidly in Arabic. She handed over forged identification papers while maintaining a casual demeanor that suggested nothing more than a routine. Medical transport. Rebecca held her breath as one of the insurgents shined a flashlight into the truck's cargo area. The wounded prisoners lay still under blankets, playing their roles as patients being transported to a mountain clinic. Dr. Vasquez wore a white coat and clutched a medical bag, looking every inch the dedicated physician. After what felt like hours, but lasted only minutes, the insurgents waved them through the checkpoint. Fatima waited until they were out of sight before allowing herself to smile with relief. "That was the easy one," she warned Rebecca. "The next checkpoint has more experienced fighters who know the local medical staff." The second encounter nearly ended in disaster. A veteran insurgent commander recognized that Dr. Vasquez wasn't from any mountain clinic, and his suspicions triggered a thorough search of the vehicle. Rebecca prepared for a firefight that would likely kill everyone in the truck, but Deputy Mayor tithed them all with an inspired performance. Speaking perfect Arabic, he convinced the commander that Vasquez was a foreign doctor brought in to treat the commander's wounded fighters. The deception worked because Khatib's political experience had taught him exactly which lies insurgent leaders wanted to hear. By dawn, all 5 vehicles had successfully navigated the mountain roads and reached the abandoned UN observation post. The facility was exactly as al-Rashid had described, empty but intact, with communication equipment that still functioned despite years of neglect. Rebecca worked feverishly to establish contact with friendly forces while her charges took shelter in the reinforced bunkers. The radio equipment was old but powerful, capable of reaching military frequencies across the region. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Major Rebecca Hayes, U.S. Army, transmitting from grid reference 847 to 321. I have 28 civilian evacuees requiring immediate extraction. Request helicopter support for emergency evacuation." The response came faster than expected, crackling through speakers that hadn't carried human voices in years. "Major Hayes, this is Colonel Marcus Garrett. Confirm your status and location." Rebecca felt a mix of relief and apprehension at hearing Garrett's voice. The man who'd doubted her capabilities now controlled her lifeline to safety. "Colonel, I'm at the old UN post with 9 American contractors and 19 local civilians. All require immediate medical attention and transportation to safe areas. Hayes, you were ordered to evacuate with the primary group. What's your current situation?" "Sir, I remained behind to complete the mission. All American personnel under my protection are alive and accounted for." The long silence that followed suggested intense discussions in whatever command center Garrett was operating from. When he returned to the radio, his voice carried a tone Rebecca had never heard before. "Major Hayes, maintain your position. We have helicopters inbound to your location, ETA 40 minutes. Outstanding work, soldier." As the rescue helicopters approached the mountain observation post, Rebecca stood watching the sunrise paint Karadesh's valley in shades of gold and crimson. Smoke still rose from various points in the city, but the worst of the fighting seemed to be subsiding. Dr. Vasquez joined her at the observation point, moving slowly but under her own power. "What you did back there," she said quietly, "that wasn't just military duty. That was something more." Rebecca thought about the question that had driven her through the longest night of her life. "Everyone deserves to go home," she replied simply. "No one gets left behind on my watch." The first helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust and rotor wash, followed quickly by 2 more aircraft. Medical personnel rushed toward the observation post, while security teams established a perimeter. After 72 hours of impossible choices and desperate gambles, the evacuation was finally beginning. But as Rebecca helped load wounded prisoners into the helicopters, she knew this was more than just a successful rescue mission. Something fundamental had changed in the relationship between a small-town American soldier and the people she'd sworn to protect. The real story was just beginning to unfold. The Pentagon's briefing room fell silent as Colonel Marcus Garrett concluded his presentation to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, High-definition satellite imagery displayed on wall-mounted screens showed the devastation in Kurdish, where insurgent forces have been systematically driven back by coalition airstrikes launched in response to Rebecca's intelligence reports. Major Hayes' unauthorized rescue operation resulted in 0 American casualties and provided crucial intelligence about insurgent command structures, Garrett reported, his voice carrying none of its previous skepticism about Rebecca's capabilities. Her actions directly led to the identification and elimination of 3 terrorist training camps in the surrounding mountains. General Patricia Williams leaned forward in her chair, studying damage assessment photographs that showed the municipal building where the detention center had operated. "Colonel, what's the current status of the civilians she rescued?" "All 19 local nationals have been relocated to secure areas within Allied territory," Garrett replied. Dr. Elena Vasquez has resumed her medical work at a refugee camp. Deputy Mayor Omar Khatib is cooperating with intelligence services to identify insurgent collaborators. The information they've provided has proven invaluable for stabilizing the region. Admiral Catherine Ross, Chief of Naval Operations, pulled up Rebecca's service record on her tablet. Major Hayes violated direct orders by remaining behind during the evacuation. However, the results speak for themselves. "What's your recommendation for disciplinary action?" Garrett paused, remembering his heated arguments against Rebecca's assignment just months earlier. His opposition had been based on conventional military thinking that emphasized following orders and minimizing risks. Rebecca's actions had challenged every assumption he'd held about proper command decisions. "Admiral, I recommend no disciplinary action," he stated firmly. Major Hayes demonstrated exceptional leadership under impossible circumstances. Her decisions saved lives and advanced strategic objectives that conventional operations failed to achieve. The deliberation that followed lasted 3 hours, with senior military leaders debating the precedent Rebecca's actions might establish. Encouraging subordinates to ignore direct orders could undermine military discipline, but rewarding innovative thinking might produce more effective leaders. Meanwhile, Rebecca herself sat in a military hospital in Germany, undergoing debriefing sessions with intelligence analysts who wanted every detail about the insurgent operations she'd observed. Her physical injuries were minor: some cuts from broken glass, bruising from the explosion concussions, and exhaustion from 3 days without proper sleep. The psychological evaluation proved more complex. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a specialist in post-combat stress disorders, conducted extensive interviews about Rebecca's decision-making process during the crisis. "You were ordered to evacuate," Dr. Mitchell noted during one session. "What factors influenced your choice to remain behind?" Rebecca stared out the hospital window at the peaceful German countryside, so different from Kurdish's war-torn landscape. "Those people trusted us to keep them safe. When the evacuation helicopter couldn't take everyone, I had 2 choices. Abandon 9 contractors to certain death, or find another way to get them home." Military doctrine emphasizes following orders and preserving force strength. Your decision violated both principles. Military doctrine also emphasizes completing the mission and protecting those under your command, Rebecca replied. Sometimes, those principles conflict, and leaders have to choose which one matters more. Dr. Mitchell made notes about Rebecca's clear reasoning and absence of post-traumatic stress symptoms. The Major's mental state remained remarkably stable despite experiencing combat situations that would have broken many experienced soldiers. News of Rebecca's rescue operation spread through military channels before reaching mainstream media. The story resonated with a public hungry for positive news about American military capabilities, especially after years of controversial overseas operations. David Kim had returned to his engineering job with Phoenix Industries, but found himself frequently interviewed about the rescue mission. His transformation from terrified civilian to effective team member became a symbol of ordinary Americans rising to extraordinary challenges. Major Hayes turned us into a team, Kim explained during a CNN interview. She didn't just protect us, she taught us to protect each other. That made all the difference when things got desperate. Jennifer Walsh had leveraged her experience into a consulting position with the State Department, advising on civilian protection protocols in conflict zones. Her fluency in Arabic and first-hand knowledge of insurgent tactics made her invaluable. For developing new evacuation procedures, Mark Stevens finally published the research data he'd nearly died protecting. His infrastructure development models, refined through the Kurdish experience, were being implemented in reconstruction projects across the Middle East. The power grid designs that had triggered the original crisis were now helping rebuild communities devastated by similar conflicts. Dr. Elena Vasquez established a mobile medical clinic that provided healthcare to refugees displaced by the Kurdish fighting. Her work drew international attention to the humanitarian crisis created when infrastructure projects became military targets. 2 months after the rescue operation, Rebecca received orders to report to the Pentagon for a ceremony she hadn't expected. The Medal of Honor recommendation had originated with her own team members, who'd written detailed accounts of her leadership during the crisis. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of her life, above and beyond the call of duty while serving as security commander during insurgent attacks in Kurdish." When evacuation capacity proved insufficient for all personnel under her protection, Major Hayes voluntarily remained in hostile territory to organize and execute a rescue operation that saved 28 civilian lives. Her extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty reflect the highest traditions of military service. Colonel Garrett personally delivered the news during a private meeting in his Pentagon office. The same room where he'd argued against her assignment now hosted a conversation about the military's highest honor. "Rebecca," he began, using her first name for the first time since they'd met, "I owe you an apology. My opposition to your assignment was based on outdated thinking about leadership and risk management." Rebecca studied Garrett's face, noting the genuine regret in his expression. "Sir, you were protecting the mission by expressing legitimate concerns about my experience level." "No," Garrett replied firmly. "I was protecting my own career by avoiding decisions that might generate criticism. You showed me the difference between leadership and management. Leaders accept responsibility for outcomes regardless of personal consequences." The medal ceremony took place on a crisp October morning with Rebecca's family in attendance. Her parents had driven from Ohio to witness their daughter receive recognition that transcended military achievements. Her younger brother, still serving as an Army sergeant, stood at attention in full-dress uniform. President Morrison presented the medal personally, speaking about courage in the face of impossible odds and the responsibility Americans had to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The ceremony was broadcast internationally, with particular attention paid to Rebecca's decision to prioritize civilian lives over personal safety. But the moment that meant most to Rebecca came after the official proceedings, when she was approached by a woman carrying a young girl. Maria Santos had traveled from a refugee camp in Jordan to attend the ceremony, bringing her daughter Sophia, as a reminder of what the rescue had truly accomplished. "Major Hayes," Maria said in careful English, "Sophia wants to thank the soldier who brought her mama home." 8-year-old Sophia stepped forward and saluted with childish precision before wrapping her arms around Rebecca's legs. The girl's presence represented 28 families who'd been reunited because one American soldier had refused to accept that some people were expendable. Dr. Al-Rashid sent a letter from Kurdish, where he'd returned to help rebuild the university. His student network had evolved into a legitimate political organization, working to establish democratic governance in areas liberated from insurgent control. "Major Hayes," his letter read, "your example inspired our young people to believe that individuals can change history through moral courage. The seeds you planted during those dark days are now growing into something beautiful. Rebecca's promotion to lieutenant colonel came with assignment to the Army's Strategic Planning Division, where her experience with unconventional operations influenced new doctrines for civilian protection in combat zones. The Hayes Protocol became standard training for officers assigned to complex, overseas missions. The protocol emphasized adaptive leadership, civilian integration, and moral decision-making under pressure. Military academies began teaching case studies based on the Kurdish rescue, using Rebecca's choices to illustrate principles that couldn't be learned from textbooks. But perhaps the most significant outcome was the change in Rebecca herself. The woman who'd once worried about proving her competence to skeptical superiors had become someone who understood that true leadership meant accepting consequences for doing what was right rather than what was safe. During a speaking engagement at West Point, a cadet asked her about the moment she decided to stay behind during the evacuation. "I didn't make a decision," Rebecca replied. "The decision was made once I understood what was at stake." When you're responsible for other people's lives, some choices become inevitable. The question that had haunted her throughout the crisis, whether she was capable of making the hard decisions required of military leaders, had been answered definitively. Not through successful completion of routine assignments, but by facing an impossible situation and finding a way forward. Colonel Garrett, now serving as Rebecca's mentor rather than skeptic, often reflected on the lessons learned from their experience together. His initial opposition to her assignment had been rooted in conventional thinking that prioritized avoiding failure over achieving extraordinary success. "Rebecca taught me that real leadership isn't about minimizing risks," he explained to a gathering of senior officers. "It's about accepting the right risks for the right reasons." She risked everything to save people who couldn't save themselves. And that decision changed how we think about military responsibility. The ripple effects of Rebecca's actions continued spreading through military and civilian communities. Phoenix Industries redesigned their overseas operations to include enhanced security protocols and cultural sensitivity training. The company's new approach emphasized building genuine partnerships with local communities, rather than simply completing contracted work. Other companies followed suit, recognizing that successful international operations required understanding and protecting the people who made such projects possible. The infrastructure development model that had emerged from the Kurdish crisis became a template for similar work in challenging environments. Rebecca's story also influenced military recruitment and training programs. Young people who might never have considered military service were inspired by an example of leadership that emphasized protection over domination, moral courage over tactical superiority. The final chapter of the Kurdish rescue came 2 years later, when Rebecca returned to the region as part of a stabilization mission. The city had been rebuilt with international assistance, featuring the power grid that Dr. Sarah Chun had originally designed. Walking through markets that bustled with renewed commerce, Rebecca encountered many of the people she'd helped rescue. They'd rebuilt their lives and their community, creating something stronger than what had existed before the crisis. Ahmed Hassan, whose broken leg had complicated the escape from the detention center, now operated a successful construction business, specializing in blast-resistant building techniques. His experience had taught him valuable lessons about structural engineering under extreme conditions. Omar Khatib had been elected mayor in Kuradesh's first democratic election, running on a platform of reconciliation and economic development. His administration worked closely with international partners while maintaining independence from foreign interference. Dr. Vasquez had established a permanent medical clinic that served as a model for healthcare delivery in post-conflict regions. Her work integrated traditional healing practices with modern medicine, creating treatments that respected local culture while providing effective care. The university that Dr. Al-Rashid had worked to rebuild became a center for peace and conflict. resolution studies, drawing students from across the Middle East who wanted to learn nonviolent approaches to social change. As Rebecca prepared to leave Karadish for the final time, she stood once again on the rooftop where her impossible journey had begun. The city spread below her looked nothing like the Warzone she remembered, but everything like the community that Chun's team had originally hoped to serve. Colonel Garrett had been wrong about many things, but he'd been absolutely correct about one crucial point. The assignment had indeed tested Rebecca's capabilities as a military leader. She'd passed that test not by following conventional procedures, but by recognizing when conventional procedures were insufficient for the challenges she faced. The woman who'd once worried about being called useless had become someone whose actions redefined what it meant to serve with honor. Her legacy lived not just in medals and citations, but in the lives she'd saved and the example she'd set for others facing their own impossible choices. Major Rebecca Hayes had walked into a war zone alone and returned with everyone. In doing so, she'd proven that sometimes the most important victories come not from destroying enemies, but from refusing to abandon the people who trust you to bring them home. 5 years after Karadish, Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Hayes found herself standing before a classroom of senior military officers at the National Defense University. The faces looking back at her represented the future of American military leadership, colonels and brigadier generals who would soon command their own operations in complex international environments. The Karadish incident has become a case study in adaptive leadership, she began, clicking to a slide showing the municipal building where everything had changed. But today, I want to discuss something more important than tactical decisions. I want to talk about the moment when you realize that your training has prepared you for everything except the choice that actually matters. The audience included several officers who'd served in similar situations, facing their own impossible decisions in places like Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia. These weren't theoretical discussions for them. They were preparing for assignments where textbook solutions might prove inadequate. Colonel James Peterson, a veteran of 3 overseas deployments, raised his hand. "Ma'am, your decision to remain behind violated direct orders and endangered additional personnel. How do we balance moral imperatives against military discipline?" Rebecca had answered variations of this question hundreds of times, but each audience brought new perspectives that deepened her understanding of the dilemma. "Colonel, the question assumes that military discipline and moral action are opposing forces. In Karadish, I discovered they're actually the same thing when properly understood." She advanced to the next slide, showing photographs of the rescued civilians who'd gone on to rebuild their lives. Military discipline exists to accomplish missions and protect people. When those objectives align with moral action, following orders is straightforward. When they conflict, leaders must choose which principle takes precedence. The classroom discussion that followed revealed how deeply the Karadish rescue had influenced military thinking. Junior officers cited Rebecca's example when justifying their own unconventional decisions in recent operations. Senior commanders incorporated her tactical innovations into official doctrine, but the most significant impact wasn't found in military manuals or training programs. It lived in the personal choices made by individuals who'd learned that sometimes doing the right thing required accepting consequences that others might consider unacceptable. Captain Maria Rodriguez had recently returned from an assignment in Eastern Europe where her unit discovered a human trafficking operation targeting refugee children. Following standard protocols would have required weeks of coordination with multiple agencies while victims remained in danger. "I thought about Major Hayes and Karadish," Rodriguez explained during the post-class discussion. "Sometimes you can't wait for permission to do what's obviously necessary. I ordered an immediate raid that freed 18 children. My superior officer was furious until he saw the conditions those kids had been living in." These stories multiplied. Across the military, as Rebecca's example encouraged others to trust their moral instincts when facing ethical dilemmas. The woman once dismissed as too green had become a symbol of principled leadership that transcended rank and experience. Dr. Sarah Chun, now directing reconstruction efforts for an international development organization, visited Rebecca during a conference in Washington. Their conversation over coffee revealed how the failed Karadish project had evolved into something more valuable than its original objectives. The power grid we never finished building became less important than the connections we made with people. Chun reflected, "Your rescue operation proved that relationships matter more than infrastructure when crisis strikes." Chun's new organization prioritized community engagement and local partnership development, lessons learned directly from the Karadish experience. Projects now included extensive cultural training and relationship-building phases designed to prevent the isolation that had made Rebecca's team vulnerable. "We're not just building power plants anymore," Chun continued. "We're building networks of mutual support that can survive political upheaval. It's slower and more complex, but the results are sustainable in ways that pure engineering solutions never were." The ripple effects extended far beyond military and development circles. David Kim had parlayed his experience into a successful consulting business that specialized in crisis management for civilian organizations. His company trained corporate executives and NGO workers to handle emergency situations in high-risk environments. People think crisis management is about having the right equipment or following proper procedures, Kim explained during one of his seminars. But Rebecca taught us that it's really about maintaining team cohesion when everything falls apart. The technical stuff is secondary to keeping people focused on shared objectives. Kim's training programs emphasized the psychological preparation that had enabled Rebecca's team to function effectively under extreme stress. Participants learned breathing techniques, decision-making frameworks, and communication protocols designed to prevent panic when normal systems failed. Jennifer Walsh had become a senior advisor to the State Department's Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, where her experience with civilian-military cooperation influenced policy development for complex emergencies. The traditional model separates military operations from humanitarian assistance, Walsh noted during a policy briefing. Rebecca showed us that integration isn't just possible, it's essential for achieving lasting results in conflict zones. Walsh's recommendations led to new protocols that embedded civilian specialists within military units while providing combat training for humanitarian workers. The hybrid approach produced teams capable of addressing both security challenges and reconstruction needs simultaneously. But perhaps the most profound impact came from Sofia Santos, the 8-year-old girl who'd been among the rescued prisoners. Now 13 and living in the United States with her mother, Sofia had begun speaking at schools about the refugee experience and the importance of helping others. "Major Hayes didn't know my name when she came to save us," Sofia told a middle school assembly in Virginia. "But she knew we were people who deserved to go home to our families. That's all anyone needs to know to do the right thing." Sofia's presentations combined personal testimony with broader lessons about citizenship and responsibility. Her audiences, young Americans who'd never experienced war or displacement, learned about global interconnection through the story of one soldier's moral courage. The girl had also maintained correspondence with Rebecca, sending letters that provided updates on her education and future plans. Sofia wanted to become a doctor like Dr. Vasquez, inspired by the medical care she'd received during the rescue operation. "When I graduate from medical school," Sofia wrote in her most recent letter, "I want to work in places where people need help the most. You showed me that one person can make a difference if they're willing to accept responsibility for others." Rebecca kept Sofia's letters in a special folder, reading them whenever she needed reminding about why the Karadish operation had been worth the risks involved. The girl's voice represented countless others whose lives had been touched by decisions made during those desperate 72 hours. The academic study of Rebecca's choices had produced volumes of analysis about leadership, ethics, and decision-making under pressure. Military historians debated whether her actions represented innovation or insubordination, while ethicists used the case to explore conflicts between duty and conscience. Professor Alan Morrison at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government had written extensively about the Kurdish rescue as an example of moral leadership in extreme circumstances. His course, Ethics in Crisis, used Rebecca's decisions as a framework for examining similar dilemmas faced by leaders throughout history. Major Hayes faced what philosophers call a tragic choice, Morrison explained to his graduate students. All available options involve significant moral costs. Her greatness lies not in finding a perfect solution, but in accepting responsibility for the consequences of imperfect action. The academic analysis validated what Rebecca had learned through experience. Leadership often required making difficult decisions with incomplete information while accepting full accountability for outcomes. Theory and practice converged in moments. When character mattered more than training. Colonel Garrett, now a brigadier general, had become one of Rebecca's strongest advocates within the military establishment. His transformation from skeptic to supporter illustrated how direct experience could change fundamental assumptions about effective leadership. I initially opposed Hayes' assignment because I confused risk aversion with sound judgment, Garrett admitted during a retirement ceremony speech. She taught me that the greatest risk is often moral failure disguised as tactical prudence. Garrett's evolved perspective influenced a generation of officers who learned to balance institutional loyalty with ethical responsibility. His mentorship emphasized the importance of developing moral courage alongside tactical expertise. The final validation of Rebecca's choices came from an unexpected source: former insurgent fighters who participated in the Kurdish conflict. Several had been captured during subsequent operations and interviewed by intelligence analysts seeking to understand their motivations and tactics. The American woman soldier became a legend among our enemies, one former insurgent revealed. During interrogation, they said she cared more about protecting civilians than following orders. Some of our fighters began questioning whether Americans were really the monsters we'd been told they were. This intelligence suggested that Rebecca's actions had achieved strategic objectives beyond the immediate rescue operation. Her demonstration of moral leadership had undermined insurgent propaganda while strengthening relationships between American forces and local populations. As Rebecca prepared for her next assignment, commanding a brigade responsible for training foreign military forces in humanitarian operations, she reflected on the journey from being called useless to becoming a symbol of principled leadership. Evaluation that had once threatened her career now seemed like a distant echo from a different life. The woman who'd worried about proving her competence had become someone whose example inspired others to embrace the moral complexity of modern military service. Standing in her Pentagon office, Rebecca looked at the photographs covering her wall. The rescued civilians rebuilding their lives, her team members pursuing meaningful careers, and Sofia Santos growing into a young woman determined to help others. These images represented something more valuable than personal achievement or professional recognition. They embodied proof that individual choices could create ripple effects, extending far beyond their immediate circumstances. Major Rebecca Hayes had walked into a war zone alone and returned with everyone. In doing so, she demonstrated that true strength lay not in avoiding difficult decisions, but in accepting full responsibility for their consequences. Her legacy lived not in medals or promotions, but in the lives she'd touched and the example she'd set for others facing their own impossible choices. The girl once dismissed as too green had become a leader whose moral courage redefined what it meant to serve with honor. And in a world that often seemed to reward expedience over principle, Rebecca's story provided enduring proof that doing the right thing regardless of personal cost remained the highest form of military service. 10 years after Karadish, Rebecca Hayes stood at the podium in the same Pentagon briefing room where Colonel Garrett had once questioned her qualifications. But now she wore the stars of a brigadier general, and the faces looking back at her belonged to a new generation of officers preparing for their own impossible assignments. The irony wasn't lost on her. The woman once deemed too inexperienced for a routine security detail now commanded the Army's International Crisis Response Division, responsible for developing rapid intervention protocols for humanitarian emergencies worldwide. Today marks the 10th anniversary of Operation Homecoming. She began using the official designation that military historians had assigned to the Karadish rescue. But I'm not here to discuss tactics or celebrate victories. I'm here to talk about the moment when you discover that your most important mission isn't the one you were assigned. In the audience sat Major Sofia Santos, now 23 and fresh from completing her military medical officer training. The same little girl who'd once clung to Rebecca's legs during the medal ceremony had followed through on her childhood promise, becoming both a doctor and a soldier. Sofia represented something unprecedented. A second generation inspired by the Karadish legacy. Her decision to join the military medical corps had been directly influenced by Dr. Vasquez's stories about the rescue operation and Rebecca's leadership during the crisis. General Hayes, Sofia said during the question period, her voice steady. Despite the emotion behind her words, you changed my family's life that night in the detention center. But what changed yours? Rebecca paused, considering a question that reached deeper than tactical analysis or leadership philosophy. The answer required acknowledging truths she'd spent years understanding about herself and the nature of moral courage. Major Santos, I learned that being useful isn't about following orders perfectly or avoiding mistakes. It's about accepting responsibility for outcomes that matter more than your own career or comfort. That night in Karadish, I discovered that true strength comes from choosing what's right over what's safe. The briefing concluded with the announcement of a new initiative, the Hayes Fellowship Program, designed to identify and develop officers with the moral courage to make difficult decisions in complex environments. Fellows would receive advanced training in ethics, cultural sensitivity, and adaptive leadership. The program's first class included officers nominated by their peers for demonstrating exceptional character under pressure. These weren't necessarily the highest ranking or most decorated soldiers, but individuals who'd shown willingness to prioritize mission, accomplishment, and troop welfare over personal advancement. Among the inaugural fellows was Captain Michael Thompson, Sergeant Dave Thompson's son, who'd grown up hearing stories about the Karadish rescue. His father's experience as Rebecca's second-in-command had shaped his understanding of leadership and sacrifice. My dad always said that Major Hayes taught him the difference between following orders and serving your country, Michael explained. During the fellowship orientation, orders come from superior officers, but your country's values come from something deeper. Sometimes they align, sometimes they don't. The younger Thompson had already distinguished himself during a peacekeeping mission in Africa, where his unit discovered a village under attack by militia forces. Despite orders to maintain a defensive posture, he'd organized a rescue operation that saved over 100 civilians. His actions mirrored Rebecca's decision-making process, assessing the situation, calculating risks and benefits, then choosing the course of action that best served the people depending on him for protection. Dr. Elena Vasquez, now in her 60s, served as a senior advisor to the fellowship program. Her experience treating wounded civilians during the rescue operation provided valuable insights about medical ethics in combat zones. Rebecca showed us that heroism isn't about grand gestures or dramatic moments, Vasquez told the fellows during their first ethics seminar. It's about making the right choice when no one's watching and accepting consequences when everyone is. Vasquez had established a network of military medical professionals who specialized in treating civilian casualties during combat operations. Her protocols emphasized rapid triage, cultural sensitivity, and the moral obligation to provide care regardless of political affiliations. The Kurdish rescue had also influenced international military cooperation in unexpected ways. Foreign officers now attended Rebecca's leadership courses, seeking to understand how American military culture could produce leaders willing to risk everything for people they barely knew. Colonel Hans Weber of the German Army had participated in joint operations with Rebecca's division during recent humanitarian crises. His observations about American military ethics reflected broader international respect for the principles demonstrated at Kurdish. General Hayes represents something unique in modern military leadership, Weber noted during a NATO conference. She combines tactical excellence with moral clarity in ways that inspire confidence among allies and respect from adversaries. This international recognition had strategic implications beyond military circles. Diplomatic initiatives now referenced the Kurdish standard when discussing humanitarian intervention and civilian protection protocols. Rebecca's influence extended into corporate and civilian leadership development as well. Business schools taught case studies based on her decision-making process, emphasizing the importance of stakeholder consideration and long-term thinking over short-term profit maximization. Mark Stevens had left Phoenix Industries to establish a non-profit organization that provided security consulting for humanitarian groups operating in dangerous regions. His company's protocols directly incorporated lessons learned during the Kurdish evacuation. Rebecca taught us that protecting people isn't just about having bigger guns or better equipment. Stevens explained to a group of NGO directors, it's about building trust, understanding local dynamics, and accepting that your safety depends on the safety of everyone around you. Stevens' organization had successfully supported relief operations in Syria, Yemen, and Ukraine, demonstrating that civilian military cooperation could achieve results impossible through traditional approaches. But perhaps the most remarkable development was the transformation of Kurdish itself into a symbol of reconciliation and reconstruction. The city had become a model for post-conflict recovery, attracting international visitors who wanted to understand how communities could rebuild after experiencing devastating violence. Dr. Al-Rashid, now serving as Kurdish's university president, had established an institute for peace and reconciliation that drew students from across the region. The curriculum emphasized nonviolent conflict resolution and the importance of moral leadership during crises. Major Hayes showed us that individual courage can change history. Al-Rashid told international visitors during institute tours, her example inspired our students to believe that they could create positive change regardless of their circumstances. The Institute's graduates had gone on to leadership positions throughout the Middle East, carrying lessons learned from the Kurdish experience into their own communities. Many cited Rebecca's willingness to risk everything for strangers as inspiration for their own service to others. Omar Khatib, still serving as Kurdish's mayor after multiple re-elections, had overseen the city's transformation into a regional center for commerce and education. The infrastructure that Dr. Chen's team had originally been contracted to build was finally completed, but with modifications that reflected lessons learned during the crisis. The power grid that almost destroyed our city became the foundation for our prosperity, Khatib noted during the 10th anniversary commemoration. But the real power came from people like General Hayes, who proved that some things are more important than following orders. As Rebecca prepared to retire from active duty, she reflected on the journey from being called useless to becoming a symbol of principled leadership. The evaluation that had once threatened her career now seemed like a necessary catalyst for discovering her true potential. Her final assignment involved establishing a permanent training center where military and civilian leaders could learn integrated approaches to crisis management. The facility would be located near Fort Bragg, where her military career had begun with such uncertainty about her Capabilities. The center's mission statement reflected everything she'd learned about leadership: to develop leaders who understand that true strength comes from serving others, that moral courage matters more than tactical excellence, and that the measure of success is not personal advancement, but positive impact on the world. On her last day in uniform, Rebecca returned to the rooftop where her impossible journey had begun. The building now served as a memorial to victims of the Kurdish crisis, but also as a reminder that individual choices could overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. Standing where she'd once watched the evacuation helicopter disappear into smoke-filled skies, Rebecca understood that Colonel Garrett's dismissive words had accidentally identified her greatest strength. Being useless according to conventional standards had freed her to pursue unconventional solutions that conventional thinking would never have attempted. The girl who'd worried about proving her competence had become a woman whose moral courage redefined what competence actually meant. Her legacy lived not in the medals covering her chest or the rank insignia on her shoulders, but in the lives she'd touched and the example she'd set for others facing their own impossible choices. Major Rebecca Hayes had walked into a war zone alone and returned with everyone. In the process, she discovered that true usefulness lay not in following orders perfectly, but in understanding when higher principles demanded a different kind of service. The woman once called useless had become indispensable to everyone who understood that doing the right thing, regardless of personal cost, remained the highest form of human service. Her story would inspire future generations to choose courage over comfort, principle over expedience, and service to others over service to self. And in a world that often seemed to reward the expedient over the ethical, Rebecca's legacy provided enduring proof that moral courage remained the most useful quality any leader could possess. 10 years after Kurdish, Rebecca Hayes stood at the podium in the same Pentagon briefing room where Colonel Garrett had once questioned her qualifications. But now she wore the stars of a brigadier general, and the faces looking back at her belonged to a new generation of officers preparing for their own impossible assignments. The irony wasn't lost on her. The woman once deemed too inexperienced for a routine security detail now commanded the Army's International Crisis Response Division, responsible for developing rapid intervention protocols for humanitarian emergencies worldwide. Today marks the 10th anniversary of Operation Homecoming. She began using the official designation that military historians had assigned to the Kurdish rescue. But I'm not here to discuss tactics or celebrate victories. I'm here to talk about the moment when you discover that your most important mission isn't the one you were assigned. In the audience sat Major Sofia Santos, now 23 and fresh from completing her military medical officer training. The same little girl who'd once clung to Rebecca's legs during the medal ceremony had followed through on her childhood promise, becoming both a doctor and a soldier. Sofia represented something unprecedented, a second generation inspired by the Kurdish legacy. Her decision to join the military medical corps had been directly influenced by Dr. Vasquez's stories about the rescue operation and Rebecca's leadership during the crisis. General Hayes, Sofia said during the question period, her voice steady. Despite the emotion behind her words, you changed my family's life that night in the detention center. But what changed yours? Rebecca paused, considering a question that reached deeper than tactical analysis or leadership philosophy. The answer required acknowledging truths she'd spent years understanding about herself and the nature of moral courage. Major Santos, I learned that being useful isn't about following orders perfectly or avoiding mistakes. It's about accepting responsibility for outcomes that matter more than your own career or comfort. That night in Kurdish, I discovered that true strength comes from choosing what's right over what's safe. The briefing concluded with the announcement of a new initiative, the Hayes Fellowship Program, designed to identify and develop officers with the moral courage to make difficult decisions in complex environments. Fellows would receive advanced training in ethics, cultural sensitivity, and adaptive leadership. The program's first class included officers nominated by their peers for demonstrating exceptional character under pressure. These weren't necessarily the highest ranking or most decorated soldiers, but individuals who'd shown willingness to prioritize mission, accomplishment, and troop welfare over personal advancement. Among the inaugural fellows was Captain Michael Thompson, Sergeant Dave Thompson's son, who'd grown up hearing stories about the Kurdish rescue. His father's experience as Rebecca's second-in-command had shaped his understanding of leadership and sacrifice. "My dad always said that Major Hayes taught him the difference between following orders and serving your country," Michael explained. During the fellowship orientation, orders come from superior officers, but your country's values come from something deeper. Sometimes they align, sometimes they don't. The younger Thompson had already distinguished himself during a peacekeeping mission in Africa, where his unit discovered a village under attack by militia forces. Despite orders to maintain a defensive posture, he'd organized a rescue operation that saved over 100 civilians. His actions mirrored Rebecca's decision-making process, assessing the situation, calculating risks and benefits, then choosing the course of action that best served the people depending on him for protection. Dr. Elena Vasquez, now in her 60s, served as a senior advisor to the fellowship program. Her experience treating wounded civilians during the rescue operation provided valuable insights about medical ethics in combat zones. Rebecca showed us that heroism isn't about grand gestures or dramatic moments, Vasquez told the fellows during their first ethics seminar. It's about making the right choice when no one's watching and accepting consequences when everyone is. Vasquez had established a network of military medical professionals who specialized in treating civilian casualties during combat operations. Her protocols emphasized rapid triage, cultural sensitivity, and the moral obligation to provide care regardless of political affiliations. The Kurdish rescue had also influenced international military cooperation in unexpected ways. Foreign officers now attended Rebecca's leadership courses, seeking to understand how American military culture could produce leaders willing to risk everything for people they barely knew. Colonel Hans Weber of the German Army had participated in joint operations with Rebecca's division during recent humanitarian crises. His observations about American military ethics reflected broader international respect for the principles demonstrated at Kurdish. General Hayes represents something unique in modern military leadership, Weber noted during a NATO conference. She combines tactical excellence with moral clarity in ways that inspire confidence among allies and respect from adversaries. This international recognition had strategic implications beyond military circles. Diplomatic initiatives now reference the Kurdish standard when discussing humanitarian intervention and civilian protection protocols. Rebecca's influence extended into corporate and civilian leadership development as well. Business schools taught case studies based on her decision-making process, emphasizing the importance of stakeholder consideration and long-term thinking over short-term profit maximization. Mark Stevens had left Phoenix Industries to establish a non-profit organization that provided security consulting for humanitarian groups operating in dangerous regions. His company's protocols directly incorporated lessons learned during the Kurdish evacuation. Rebecca taught us that protecting people isn't just about having bigger guns or better equipment, Stevens explained to a group of NGO directors. It's about building trust, understanding local dynamics, and accepting that your safety depends on the safety of everyone around you. Stevens' organization had successfully supported relief operations in Syria, Yemen, and Ukraine, demonstrating that civilian military cooperation could achieve results impossible through traditional approaches. But perhaps the most remarkable development was the transformation of Kurdish itself into a symbol of reconciliation and reconstruction. The city had become a model for post-conflict recovery, attracting international visitors who wanted to understand how communities could rebuild after experiencing devastating violence. Dr. Al-Rashid, now serving as Qaradesh's university president, had established an institute for peace and reconciliation that drew students from across the region. The curriculum emphasized nonviolent conflict resolution and the importance of moral leadership during crises. Major Hayes showed us that individual courage can change history. Al-Rashid told international visitors during institute tours. Her example inspired our students to believe that they could create positive change regardless of their circumstances. The institute's graduates had gone on to leadership positions throughout the Middle East, carrying lessons learned from the Qaradesh experience into their own communities. Many cited Rebecca's willingness to risk everything for strangers as inspiration for their own service to others. Omar Khatib, still serving as Qaradesh's mayor after multiple re-elections, had overseen the city's transformation into a regional center for commerce and education. The infrastructure that Dr. Chen's team had originally been contracted to build was finally completed, but with modifications that reflected lessons learned during the crisis. The power grid that almost destroyed our city became the foundation for our prosperity, Khatib noted during the 10th anniversary commemoration. But the real power came from people like General Hayes, who proved that some things are more important than following orders. As Rebecca prepared to retire from active duty, she reflected on the journey from being called useless to becoming a symbol of principled leadership. The evaluation that had once threatened her career now seemed like a necessary catalyst for discovering her true potential. Her final assignment involved establishing a permanent training center where military and civilian leaders could learn integrated approaches to crisis management. The facility would be located near Fort Bragg, where her military career had begun with such uncertainty about her capabilities. The center's mission statement reflected everything she'd learned about leadership: to develop leaders who understand that true strength comes from serving others, that moral courage matters more than tactical excellence, and that the measure of success is not personal advancement, but positive impact on the world. On her last day in uniform, Rebecca returned to the rooftop where her impossible journey had begun. The building now served as a memorial to victims of the Qaradesh crisis, but also as a reminder that individual choices could overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. Standing where she'd once watched the evacuation helicopter disappear into smoke-filled skies, Rebecca understood that Colonel Garrett's dismissive words had accidentally identified her greatest strength. Being useless, according to conventional standards, had freed her to pursue unconventional solutions that conventional thinking would never have attempted. The girl who'd worried about proving her competence had become a woman whose moral courage redefined what competence actually meant. Her legacy lived not in the medals covering her chest or the rank insignia on her shoulders, but in the lives she'd touched and the example she'd set for others facing their own impossible choices. Major Rebecca Hayes had walked into a war zone alone and returned with everyone. In the process, she discovered that true usefulness lay not in following orders perfectly, but in understanding when higher principles demanded a different kind of service. The woman once called useless had become indispensable to everyone who understood that doing the right thing, regardless of personal cost, remained the highest form of human service. Her story would inspire future generations to choose courage over comfort, principle over expedience, and service to others over service to self. And in a world that often seemed to reward the expedient over the ethical, Rebecca's legacy provided enduring proof that moral courage remained the most useful quality any leader could possess. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.